he made some major announcements, $1 billion in humanitarian aid for people displaced by drought or famine across Africa, new commitments to the Libido corridor, which is not only the U.S.'s largest rail investment out of the continent, it's also sort of a huge economic uplifter, not only for Africa.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by White House reporter Christian Datoc. Christian, I've watched a lot of White House briefings over the past year, and I was regularly reassured that President Biden was never going to pardon his son Hunter. The president himself said that a couple of times, but certainly the White House press office said it many more times. How has the White House been dealing with the fallout from the pardon?
Not well, Jim, to be quite frank. And like you mentioned, this is something that we didn't think was going to happen, at least assuming Vice President Harris, or even when Joe Biden was still running for the presidency, if he were to defeat Donald Trump in the election. But after November 5th, I guess all bets were off. And when it comes to, engaging with the press and trying to handle what's quite frankly a hostile environment in the press room or on Air Force One, talking to reporters 12 hours after this Hunter Biden pardon goes down, it seemed like this might have been Karine Jean-Pierre's moment where she was the most out of her element. I mean, again, we've seen frequently over the last 3 years her not being able to defend the Biden administration's policies or moves or politicking, what have you. But this one is totally indefensible. Again, because the president himself, for a year essentially, has said, I will not pardon my son, I will not grant him clemency. And this has opened up a whole new can of worms from Democrats about who Joe Biden needs to include in his final slate of pardons. There's the idea that maybe there are these J6 committee lawmakers or other never Trump Republicans or some Democrats who the incoming Trump administration might try and target. Maybe Joe Biden should give them preemptive pardons. But again, the cat's out of the bag, and this is just a sad end to what's been a sad presidency for Joe Biden.
But unlike Hunter Biden, I mean, these things that are being discussed are totally preemptive. None of these people are facing any legal charges currently.
No, not at all. And the Democratic strategists I've talked to say they would be surprised if Joe Biden were to give these sort of preemptive pardons. But they were also surprised that he pardoned his son. So again, we don't really know where Joe Biden, in his final days in office, wants to take this thing. And if he really believes Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy, like, again, he's talked about for the better part of the last 5 to 6 years, he might make some moves that we didn't expect a normal lame duck president in his shoes to make.
So President Biden has done a trip to Africa. It's, I believe, going to be his last major trip of his presidency. How did that go, and what sort of things were people saying about this concluding trip?
Well, this Africa trip was really like the Biden presidency in a nutshell. He went overseas. He promised to visit Angola. He was the first sitting U.S. president to ever visit Angola, and he made some major announcements, $1 billion in humanitarian aid for people displaced by drought or famine across Africa, new commitments to the Libido corridor, which is not only the U.S.'s largest rail investment out of the continent, it's also sort of a huge economic uplifter, not only for Africa, but when it comes to the West's general pushback on China's Belt and Road Initiative in the first place. So on the surface, this was a big trip. It was a capstone end to Biden's foreign policy in office. But all the headlines got stolen because he appeared to fall asleep at a meeting on Wednesday. It's classic Joe Biden. I don't know what we should have expected out of him at this point in time.
Right. So closer to home, there's been an interesting development in the upcoming Michigan governor's race. We had an interesting candidate potentially get into that race. It's a state that's been pretty heavily Democratic, but Trump won it again in November, won it in 2016, was close in 2020. Talk a little bit about who this person is.
Well, the big splash you referenced is Mike Duggan, the Detroit mayor, very favorable Democrat, sort of a powerhouse in the state Democratic Party. He is running for governor because Gretchen Whitmer is terming out in 2026, but he announced that he's going to leave the Democratic Party and run as an independent. I mean, this is sort of the first inklings of the potential machine falling apart in Michigan. And when you look at Kamala Harris's performance compared to Joe Biden in 2020, and even compared to Hillary Clinton back in 2016, even though she lost, she severely underperformed in those major urban areas. And you have to imagine the Progressive Party, especially the large Muslim and Arab American populations, they had something to do with it based on that protest against the administration's ongoing Middle Eastern policies. I don't know if Duggan will win. There are a bunch of other contenders, including Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who actually made Michigan his home address back in 2022. But it is interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see similar, situations across the country. Democrats in some of these swing states saying, hey, the party has left us behind. We need to get back to focusing on voters and issues that matter most to American households. It's certainly a surprise that nobody expected would lead this Michigan gubernatorial race.
And at one time, Michigan was considered the strongest of the blue wall states, and
That's right.
Harris didn't carry it.
Nope.
Thank you, Christian. You can read Christian and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.